do a brief overview of the funding formulas. We get a lot of bills and discussions here in this committee and trying to work around solving some of the disparities and inequities that we sometimes hear from our schools about. So I thought even after a couple of years of being on the committee and digging into all this, it still isn't always clear. So we've asked our staff to go through once again. We're going to get an overview, and then I'm going to encourage members to ask as many questions as you can think of. We may not have the answers today, but we will work on getting them so that we can have a better understanding yet of how all of these categoricals and such play together as we look at what our budget is going to be. So with that, Mr. Arneson, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. My name is Bjorn Arneson. I'm a member of the nonpartisan Senate Council Research and Fiscal Analysis staff. As Chair Rarick mentioned, you requested this presentation from our staff with particular interest in some of the longer term trends in school finance and an examination of some reasons why district revenues per pupil might vary across districts and across time. So I appreciate the opportunity to present, and I hope that it is a helpful way to think about some of these issues in this context. To some degree, the presentation today follows on presentations made yesterday by Ms. Hofer and Ms. Erickson and Mr. Farron from MDE. And so I hope you find the kind of through connection from yesterday to today. And I want to be clear at the outset that in my role as nonpartisan staff to this committee, I'm not making a judgment about whether these trends, displayed on the following slides are good or bad or desirable or not or intended or not. But I'm trying to be responsive to Senator Rarick's request that the committee have this information to examine the trends, understand the sources of this variation. This presentation is focused on school districts, but one could make additional observations about variations in resources among charter schools or cooperative entities or other elements of our school finance system. So the presentation overview, we begin with a couple key terms and concepts that are likely very familiar to members of this committee. We'll look at trends in school district revenue sources across time, trends in general fund revenues, aids, and levies, take a close look at a few selected general education revenue programs, a brief overview of special education revenue, not to supersede what we heard from Ms. Erickson, Mr. Farron yesterday, but just another reminder, and then looking at some categorical revenue programs. So to begin with a couple key terms, in our system of school finance, which is comprised of resources from the federal government, from the state government, and from the local governments, local school districts in the form of property taxes. We often talk about revenues to school districts. That is the money available for school districts to spend, and it is composed of the sum of aid from the state and resources obtained from the local property taxes. Depending on the program that we're looking at, the local property tax levy is spread on one of two local tax bases, referendum market value or net tax capacity. In general, the referendum market value is the tax base on which the voter-approved referendum levy is spread, local optional levy, the equity levy, which we'll touch on later, and the transition levy. Every other school levy, including facility levies, other general education levies, are spread on the other tax base, net tax capacity. Referendum market value is the taxable market value of all taxable property in the district, not including ag land, seasonal recreational properties or cabin properties, and certain post-secondary student housing. The net tax capacity base includes the taxable market value as modified by the property's classification rate. And those classification rates are not in this committee's jurisdiction, but we often pay attention to them when the taxes committee is looking at those classification rates. Another key concept is adjusted net tax capacity. This is the value of net tax capacity adjusted by the Commissioner of Revenue to account for varying assessment practices in jurisdictions around the state. So when we talk about ANTC, that's adjusted net tax capacity, and it's a way to, in our school finance formulas, to calculate the equalizing share of aid and levy in equalized levy programs. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, but we often talk about ANTC. So that's another acronym members surely have heard before. Speaking of equalization, many of the school finance formulas in general education and outside of general education are equalized levies, meaning that it's a revenue program funded by some mix of state aid and local property tax revenues. And that ratio of aid to levy is responsive to each individual school district's tax base. One goal of levy equalization is to minimize the disparities across school districts in the tax rates that districts have to impose to obtain the same amount of money. So in Chair Eric's kind of framing of this conversation, to some degree, local tax effort can be a way in which there is variation among school districts that isn't evident in the amount of revenue that district is raising, but it's evident in the amount of effort required by local property taxpayers to obtain that revenue. Equalization can also be used to achieve certain statewide property tax relief goals or to adjust state spending to meet state budget constraints or other objectives. In the chart in the right-hand side of the slide, and obviously this is just kind of a toy example. It doesn't represent any particular program, but it's a way to understand kind of in general how these formulas work. As one goes from left to right on the x-axis or the horizontal axis with less wealth per pupil or ANTC per pupil on the left-hand side, moving to the right, there comes a point where the district's wealth per pupil reaches a level where the district raises all of its revenue in that program from the local property tax levy. And at that point and above, we sometimes refer to those districts as off the formula, meaning that those districts under the formula are determined to have enough own source resources to fund their operations without any additional state equalization aid. As I said earlier, the school finance system is...
Mr. Arneson, can we?
Yes.
Chair Kunish.
Thank you. Are there some schools that are off the formula in Minnesota? Are there some districts or schools?
Mr. Chair and Senator Kunish, yes. There are many districts that are off the formula, and there will be a slide later kind of showing one kind of element of that. I can have more detailed information for you, district by district, but the short answer is yes.
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
A quick follow-up on that, just to verify. That's just for some specific programs, but not for their general funding. They'll always get like the per pupil funding from the formula, but certain programs, they might come off the formula, correct?
Senator Rarick and members, yeah, so in an equalized program, equalized levy, it's very likely that there are at least some districts off the formula in most of these equalized programs, like referendum levies, local optional levies, equity levies, operating capital levies. Those are all equalized levy programs.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And while we're on this slide of levy equalization, just to make sure I'm thinking of this correctly, so if we don't adjust this formula, won't more and more schools just continue to come, quote unquote, off the formula altogether? And at some point, they would all be off the formula. Is that accurate?
Mr. Ernst.
Mr. Chair and Senator Kuhn, I think that is accurate, especially in a kind of a context where, in general, property values are increasing and student enrollment is flat or decreasing slightly. So to the extent that these formulas compare a district's property wealth per pupil to some statutory factor, over time, unless the legislature adjusts those fixed factors, more and more districts will be off the formula. I would say most of the equalization formulas in the K-12 code do have fixed statutory factors. There's a program called long-term facilities maintenance, which is a facilities kind of financing program. That particular program does not have a fixed statutory factor, but the factor there is kind of calculated each year based on, a proportion of the state average property wealth per pupil. So in that context, into the future, roughly 20% of the revenue is going to be obtained on a statewide basis in the form of state aid. So, the defect that you cited probably doesn't exist in the same way in that program, but it would exist in most other programs. So in a system where school district revenue sources consist of federal aids and state aids and local aids, it's kind of helpful to think about what's the magnitude of these aids. These data are from a report produced periodically by MMB called the Price of Government or the Cost of Government. In fiscal 2025, approximately 8% of school district revenues came from the feds. Roughly 2/3 came from the state, and roughly, just over a quarter came from local sources. And I want to correct this slide that, the blue box at the bottom consists not just of local property tax receipts, but all local sources, including sales, fees, think, sports registration fees, in prior periods, a good chunk of meal sales, et cetera. Those are local resources that are included in this roughly 1/4.
We have a quick question. Senator Lucero.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you. I'm still back one slide trying to catch up with you, and I'm looking at the bullet point. So I apologize having to go back here, but I'm looking at the second bullet point there, and I'm just reading the descriptions in the bottom, or the last sentence of the second bullet point. In this way, equalization reduces the property tax burden for school services, especially for districts with relatively small tax bases. And my question is, what is the definition of small tax base? Because in my community, there is two tax bases. There's residential tax base, and then there's the commercial industrial tax base. And so if the definition of small is the amount of tax revenue that's collected, that wouldn't fully capture what's happening in my community, in that because it is a very large residential tax base, while it may not be small in terms of dollar amount, when a levy is proposed, it falls disproportionately on the backs then of residential homeowners. And therefore, contrary to other communities that have a larger commercial industrial, so a levy is more paid by CI property and less by residential. So my question is providing some clarity on what is meant by small tax base.
Mr. Chair, and Senator Lucero, in this context, by small, I mean relative to the statutory equalizing factor, that district's ANTC per pupil is relatively small. You raised an important point about the composition of the tax base, and that can vary widely among school districts. For the purposes of this committee, almost always this committee is concerned only with the total property tax base, meaning the total referendum market value or the total net tax capacity. To some degree, the composition of the tax base is when one thinks about net tax capacity, you know, applying various classification rates to certain property classes, that's within the control of the legislature, but it's not in the jurisdiction of this particular committee. So that would be in the jurisdiction of the Taxes Committee, and that's a conversation that they have oftentimes over there. There is one program where we do kind of get into modifying the tax base for a certain property class, and it's again in the long-term facilities maintenance equalization program, where the ANTC per pupil in that program includes a subtraction for a portion of ag land in that district. So I think that was a proposal in the legislature maybe about 10 years ago to make it, you know, somewhat easier for ag-heavy districts to come on to the equalizing formula in that particular program. But I can't think of any other program where we're kind of making a special modification to one of those two main tax bases. This again is a slide, pardon me, a slide from the most recent Price of Government report. And it shows, you know, since 1984, the kind of general share of total school district revenues by source. So these are using the definitions in the Cost of Government report for state, local, and federal sources. For each year on the chart, the values of each line sum to 100%. So just looking at the top line, we see that in fiscal year 2025, in this Price of Government report, roughly 65% of school district revenues were from state sources. Members surely will notice that in fiscal year 2023, there was a kind of a sea change. That corresponds with the year that the legislature enacted quite a major reform of the kind of state local finance system, including a state takeover of what had previously been a statewide general education levy. In the year previous, in fiscal 2002, the year previous to the spike in the chart there, the statewide general levy totaled approximately $1.3 billion. And beginning in fiscal 2003, the general education levy was eliminated, and the amount formerly levied was paid in state aid from the state general fund. That was also the year, the 2001 legislature also transferred a portion of referendum authority from that program to the formula allowance. And that transfer also had the effect of increasing the share of state aids and reducing the local property tax share. But members can see since that time that the relative share of revenues from state, local, and federal sources has remained, you know, relatively stable with somewhat temporary changes during periods of recession and for COVID era federal stimulus. Another way to look at this chart, you know, using this data would be to look at a chart displaying intergovernmental revenues, local tax revenues, and kind of other revenues, like these, you know, lunch sales and registration fees that I mentioned. And that, you know, that tells a similar story, but, you know, might more acutely kind of call out the trends in local property tax receipts. This chart shows the proportion of state and local tax revenues by source. So just looking at tax revenues. Again, we see a similar dynamic around fiscal year 2003, accounting for the legislative changes I mentioned earlier. And since then, when we're thinking only about tax revenues between state and local sources, roughly 3/4 comes from the state and roughly 1/4 from local sources. This slide, to some degree, goes to Senator Lucero's earlier inquiry about tax rates. These two slides show school district average local tax rates for the last 20 years or so. These data are from the Department of Revenue. They have a very good online tool and data set for almost any sort of tax, property tax metric one would want to look at. The charts display the statewide average local district tax rates for the two main property tax bases: net tax capacity on the left and referendum market value on the right. In our system, the local tax rate is a function of a school district's certified levy and the value of the underlying property tax base. So as Senator Kroon mentioned earlier, as the underlying property tax base increases in value, all else equal, that requires a lower tax rate. And so it's a little bit hard to interpret what exactly these charts mean, because one might see, for example, in the last several years on the right-hand chart, a decrease in the referendum market value rate. But that, doesn't necessarily mean that school districts are raising less money in those programs. It probably more likely means that the value of property in that tax base is increasing faster than historical norms. The values displayed here are the local tax rate after accounting for any levy equalization aid, but before accounting for any other programs that might also reduce a property's effective tax rate, including property tax credits. One thinks of the debt service, the school building bond agricultural credit, which reduces the tax effort required for debt service levies on agricultural land. The homestead property tax refund and renters refund aren't in the jurisdiction of this committee, but those programs also kind of reduce the effective tax rate for property taxpayers eligible for those programs. Again, to Senator Lucero's point, the local property tax rate, these are average rates, but the local, the individual school district rate varies quite widely. And part of that variation, of course, could be explained by different preferences, expressed by school districts for higher levels of service, newer buildings, smaller class sizes. They're obtaining additional revenues from their voter-approved levies and otherwise. Other variation, of course, could be explained by just differences in the tax base. In Pay 24, if we rank the districts from highest rate to lowest rate, the local NTC rate for the district at the 75th percentile was roughly double the rate for the district at the 25th percentile. And for the market value levies, that ratio between the 75th and 25th ranked district was approximately 1.8. So, that's kind of the order of magnitude of the variation in the rate across the whole distribution. Here's a table showing the property tax base per pupil, again, for the two main equalizing tax bases. And we observe a similar pattern, that for fiscal year 2025 or taxes payable in calendar 2024, the referendum market value per resident pupil for the district at the 75th quintile was not quite double the market value per pupil for the district at the 25th quintile. And if we look at ANTC per pupil, that ratio is almost exactly 2 to 1. So that's some measure of the variation across the whole distribution. This chart displays school district combined general fund revenues expressed as a percent change per pupil beginning in fiscal year 2003. And many of these charts begin in 2003 because to make comparisons prior to that year, you kind of lose the thread, because 2003 was the first year of that major reform that I described earlier, where the state took over the general education levy and bought off, more than $1 billion of local property tax. So comparisons on aid and revenue, historical time-based comparisons prior to that are somewhat more limited. We see that in nominal terms, general fund revenue per pupil has increased nearly 118% between 2003 and 2025, and forecasted to increase into the near future under current law assumptions. And adjusted for inflation, using the Consumer Price Index, general fund revenue per pupil has increased approximately 25% between 2003 and 2025. The temporary change in fiscal year 2010, members are curious, is attributable to some one-time American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, or ARRA, federal fund stabilization aid that sent about roughly $500 million to the state for E12 that provided some one-time savings to the state general fund. But otherwise, the trend is fairly consistent. Obviously, there are periods where the inflation-adjusted revenues per pupil have gone negative from one year to the next, but in nominal terms, the revenues per pupil have increased over time.
We have a quick question. Senator Farnsworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I just want to make sure that I'm clear about the slide that you currently have up there. So are you saying that even adjusted for inflation, revenues to school districts are higher currently than they were in 2003? And can we assume that that's all school districts, or is that an average, or am I completely misreading that?
Mr. Chair and Senator Farnsworth, yes, on average, school district combined general fund revenues are what did I say? 25% higher in 2025 after adjusting for inflation than they were in 2003. That's a statewide average, so it's possible that some districts might have experienced changes less than that statewide average or greater than the statewide average. Another kind of thing to take note of is that this is only school district general fund revenues, so not including revenues in the nutrition fund, the community service fund, the debt service fund, other funds. The general fund revenue, as Ms. Hofer indicated yesterday, is kind of the bulk of it, and the fund that tends to be the most flexible, and the one that this committee, often is modifying programs within. Here's a second chart from the same source, and I should have said that these charts are from data from MDE School Finance. Excel workbooks for previous periods are posted on the MDE Data Center, and they're very, very good resources for members or others who are interested in understanding either individual district trends over time or statewide or for other groups of districts. This chart shows school district combined general fund state aid expressed as a % change per pupil. So whereas the previous slide included property tax revenues also, this slide is limited to state aid. So again, in nominal terms, between 2003 to the present, state aid per pupil has increased approximately 83% and forecast to increase into the future. After adjusting for inflation, general fund state aid per pupil has increased approximately 5.5% between 2003 and 2025. And it probably is obvious to most, but the decrease in inflation-adjusted aid in fiscal 22 and 23, for example, is attributable, at least in part, to relatively high measured inflation in those two periods, relative to a kind of historical average annual inflation amount. So as we think about general education revenue, which is the largest component of school district revenues, it tends to be the primary funding source for school districts. It's the sum of more than a dozen distinct components that we can talk about in some detail later. It's mostly state aid, but as I mentioned earlier, there are some equalized levy programs in there. It's very flexible, and it is the largest component of the state education budget, as Ms. Hofer indicated yesterday in her presentation. This pie chart displays school district total general education revenues in fiscal year 2025. And again, this is a state average, so it's going to be somewhat different for individual districts. But on average, basic revenue, or the formula allowance, accounts for about 68% of all school district general education revenues in this year. The next three largest programs are compensatory aids, about 8%, referendum revenues, about 10%, and the school board approved local optional revenue program, which is about 7%. Every other remaining program in general education sums to 7 or 8% of the total. So these are the main ones. So if we look at those main four, as a share of total school district general education revenues over time, we see that, again, basic revenue has been the largest component of general education revenue over time, though its relative share of general education revenue has decreased over this 25-year period or so. During that same period, the sum of referendum and local optional revenues has increased in share over that period. And compensatory aids have never exceeded 10%, but under the recent enactments in that program, compensatory aids are, as we said, roughly 8% of general education revenues. And the reason for the purposes of this slide, combined referendum and local optional revenue into a single line is that the legislature in the last 12 years or so has periodically transferred a portion of referendum authority to the local optional revenue program. So kind of removing a portion of the voter-approved authority and moving it to a school board-approved program. And in some ways that transfer has had, a similar effect to the transfer I mentioned at the top of the presentation, where the legislature transferred in 2001 $415 of referendum authority to the formula allowance. So it all else equal, that has the effect of for a district who doesn't have referendum authority, at least equal to the amount transferred, that's new revenue to that district. And it might have some impact on the aid levy mix for that district, depending on the relative strength of the equalizing in the program that you're transferring from and the program you're transferring to. In each of these years on the graph, the total proportion of these four programs has ranged between 91% and 94% of general education revenues. So, it's been relatively stable when you sum the four, but looking at the trends in any one of the components, one can make observations about what's happening and what the policy response might be. And you can kind of think about, these four programs, and it's kind of a general example that applies to the whole school finance system, but think about these programs as each having particular characteristics. So the basic revenue has characteristics including, kind of uniformity, statutory uniformity. It's a single amount per pupil unit. Referendum revenue has characteristics including, responsiveness to local voter preferences, because those revenues have to be approved by voters. Local optional revenue has characteristics including decisions, revenue authority under the discretion of the school board, and also kind of a stronger equalizing scheme, especially for first-tier local optional revenues. And finally, among these examples, compensatory revenues has characteristics including that it's computed on other characteristics of the school district. And in compensatory, in general, it's computed on the enrollment of students eligible for free or reduced price lunch. So these four programs have characteristics, and as the legislature makes decisions over time, or as kind of underlying trends change over time, the strength or the weight of one program decreases and the weight of another program increases, and that changes the kind of net characteristics of the whole school finance system. Here's a slide that I kind of alluded to earlier, and I think it was related to Senator Kunish's question about are there districts off the equalization formulas. And this slide displays referendum and local optional levy share of total referendum and local optional revenues. So of the total revenue in those two programs, the sum of the revenue, how much of it is raised from the local levy and how much is paid in state aid. And we see that over time, again, in the last 25 years or so, that there have been periods where a greater share of money in those programs has been obtained by equalization aid. And at present, we're in a period where, you know, the vast majority of it is paid by local property taxpayers. And as that proportion shifts over time, it kind of makes this question about ability to pay or local tax effort, you know, somewhat more salient, right? As more of the revenue is obtained from local property taxpayers, there may be reasons to think carefully about how easy is it for local property taxpayers to bear that cost.
Mr. Chair.
Senator Kroon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this is, on this current slide here, I'm looking at the 95% number. Of the 5%, wouldn't, if I'm understanding your whole presentation correctly here, wouldn't the vast majority of that actually be in the local optional? Is that, am I getting that right?
Mr. Chair and Senator Kroon, I think that's exactly right. If we're thinking only about the referendum levy, you know, in round numbers, that's, I think it's forecast in this forecast to be roughly $1 billion in total revenue in that program. About $20 million of it is equalization aid. So 2%, you know, by fiscal 27, I think is the year where it hits $1 billion in total revenue. And under current assumptions, 2% of it is paid in equalization aid. But you're correct that the strongest, in these two programs, the strongest equalization is in the first tier local optional program. So that's where the bulk of it's going to be. This is another slide showing the basic revenue as a share of total school district general fund revenues. So not total revenues, but general fund revenues. Again, the kind of the biggest fund, the most flexible fund. And we see that over time, basic revenue has decreased as a share of those revenues in that fund from, you know, somewhere north of 70% in 2003 to slightly less than half in the current fiscal year. And again, you know, I don't mean any of these charts to suggest that these trends are unintended or undesirable, but trying to be responsive to the chair's direction to look in particular at programs where there, you know, long-term trends or the features of the program might cause some variation among districts. And part of the story on this slide, I think, is, as Ms. Hofer suggested yesterday, that increasingly the share of special education aid in the general fund is occupying a larger proportion of the general fund. And, you know, the flip side of that coin is that, you know, basic revenue and other general fund components are going to occupy a smaller share. Each year, MDE makes a report to the legislature called the General Education Revenue Disparity Report. And to some degree, it answers some of the questions that the committee might have. The most recent report covers fiscal years 19 to 25, and it was received last February. All the reports are archived on the Reference Library mandated reports database. The table at the right is a screenshot from the most recent report, and the highlighting here was in the MDE report, but, so it's not my highlighting, but we can use it to kind of look in particular at these ratios. So looking at this sum of basic, referendum, local optional, and equity revenue per ADM among school districts in fiscal year 2024, which is the second column from the right. The yellow highlighted cell shows the ratio between the 95th and 5th quantile revenue per ADM. So another way to interpret it is the 95th percentile district obtained or received 26% more revenue per pupil in those particular revenue programs than the district at the fifth percentile. And that amounts, in dollar terms, that amounts to almost $2,100 per pupil. The report also makes recommendations. The statute requires the report to make recommendations on how to address this. And if one looks at the recent reports, they generally kind of revolve around trying to find ways to thinking back to the discussion about weights in the system, finding ways to unweight the impact of referendum revenue in the system and increase the weights of other programs in the system, including equity revenue, which kind of works opposite to referendum authority. So the more referendum revenue a district has, all else equal, the less equity revenue that district is going to generate, and vice versa. So if members are interested in digging into this further, I would refer them, at least initially, to these reports archived on the reference library database. A couple brief slides on special education aid, and I don't want to trample all over anything that Ms. Erickson and Mr. Farron presented yesterday, because it was excellent information, and some of this is duplicative of that. But variation in revenue in special education programs is also kind of a significant driver of differences among districts. And so a couple slides here. In fiscal 2024, more than 165,000 children birthed to age 21 received special education services. And that figure corresponds to the figure on slide 9 of Ms. Erickson's slide deck from yesterday. And the aid amount is a function of initial aid, transportation aid, which is a portion of initial aid, and other particular programs. This committee hears a lot about the special education cross subsidy, and probably don't need to go into too much detail about what it is, but in summary, it's the amount that a district's expenditures on special ed exceed the district's categorical revenues for special ed. And in a district where a cross subsidy exists, that district pays that cross subsidy from other general fund revenues. A program first enacted in 2019 and increased by the 2023 legislature reduces that cross subsidy by 44% of the remaining net cross subsidy in the current year, and beginning in fiscal 2027, we'll reduce it by half. These slides look very familiar because they're almost identical to what Ms. Erickson presented yesterday, except hers included 2 more years of data at the right-hand side of the chart. So again, in the context of identifying sources of variation in school district revenues, we see that the total special education cross subsidy has varied over time. Programs to reduce the cross subsidy enacted and increased, especially by the 2023 legislature, will reduce the cross subsidy by roughly half into the future. If we look at this figure per pupil, again, we see the same sort of trend that in fiscal 2016 perhaps, the state average cross subsidy per pupil was about $1,100. In the most recent year, it's, roughly half of that, due mostly in part to the cross-subsidy reduction aid enacted by the legislature. If we look at the difference in the cross-subsidy by district group, here's again where we see some variation in the cross-subsidy amount. On average, in fiscal year 2023, I should say this data is from the most recent mandated report to the legislature, received June 2024, and it describes fiscal year 2023 special education cross subsidies. So these figures are kind of before the increase in the special education cross subsidy reduction aid would be effective, but they kind of give you a sense of the variation and the proportions here. On average, the cross subsidy per adjusted pupil unit was $842. If one looks at various kind of groupings of districts, that cross subsidy per pupil unit varies from more than $1,300 in Minneapolis and St. Paul on average to smaller amounts in greater Minnesota. And the amount displayed for charter schools is the amount remaining after any charter school billing and the state aid that would otherwise accrue to charter schools to cover a portion of their remaining cross subsidy.
We have another question. Senator Farnsworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Looking at the cross subsidies across the state, do you have any idea why all of the greater Minnesota schools are below the state average and they receive significantly less than all of the metro schools, and also charter schools are dramatically lower than even the greater Minnesota schools?
Mr. Chair and Senator Farnsworth, it's a good question. Are you on this slide, slide 22? Yeah, I think so. The amounts here display the adjusted net cross subsidy. So think of this as not the amount of revenue to the district, but it's the amount of spending that isn't otherwise covered by categorical aids. So this is the amount remaining that has to be paid by those districts from other general fund revenues typically. So I suppose there are any number of possible explanations for this. Higher costs of providing services in certain parts of the state, enrollment of students with types of specific disability categories that tend to be more expensive. Propensity for families with children who need certain kinds of services to locate in parts of the state that have complementary systems available for those families. With regard to the charter schools specifically, it would be helpful to understand that a charter school that provides special education services historically has been able to bill back to the resident school district, a great proportion of the unreimbursed cost. So in general, the resident school district is responsible for paying the bulk of the cost. Recently, the legislature has decided that most charter schools should pay a portion of should bear the burden of a portion of the unreimbursed cost. So the amount on this chart represents that portion. So this is the portion that kind of remains the responsibility of the charter school.
Senator Kroon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I appreciate these numbers on this slide and Senator Farnsworth's questions. And I appreciate your attempt at coming up with possible reasons for the discrepancies here. And some of them the charter school one makes sense. That one I can get my head around. And cost for services based on areas, I think maybe could factor in. Self-selection by parents could factor in. But I don't think they account for this wide of a discrepancy. And I know it's not your job to necessarily come up and explain why you're presenting the numbers, and I appreciate that. But I do think that this is something that we as a committee need to grapple with as we move forward. I've been a big advocate of reducing the special education cross-subsidy, or, adding resources to that. But we have to do that work with these numbers in mind. And you would think that, just broadly speaking, and I'm not an expert on this nearly like Senator Farnsworth would be, but we shouldn't be seeing this wide of discrepancies in these rates from outstate Minnesota versus the metro. It wouldn't necessarily be perfect. I understand that. There are those factors, but you would think, just as a general rule, just because of where you live, you're not going to have this higher level of special education needs. So I don't have the explanation, but throwing it out there for anybody who's watching who thinks they have that explanation, to come and see me, because I'm interested in it, and I think it's just something we need to grapple with.
Senator Westland.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just trying to wrap my head around this as well. Part of what the explanation you gave, as I understood it, was that some of those costs may be covered by other funding sources. Did I understand that correctly, or that some of these costs may be reflected in other funding sources?
Yeah, Mr. Chair and Senator Westland, yes, to the extent that a district needs to provide the service, but the categorical aids to pay for that service are not adequate to pay the full cost, the district has to pay the remaining cost from some other source. And the remaining cost is essentially what we know as the cross subsidy.
Mr. Chair. I'm just going to say once again, as someone who is on Education Finance Committee and not an expert in any of this, surely there has to be, any person out listening to this committee trying to understand all of our funding sources and how this works and how to make sure that every kid's getting adequate funding, this is so complicated, and surely there has to be a better way. That's just my opinion.
Thank you. That's partly why I wanted to start digging into this, because you're exactly right. It's hard to understand, and I'll maybe work with Chair Kunish. Maybe at some point we could bring some folks in from our schools from varying areas to help us understand how their costs get to be where they're at. So we can, again, we have so many bills that come forward around this area, and yet we don't always get that full picture as to why. So I'll give it to Senator Lucero.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And on this topic, in the last several weeks, or the weeks leading up to the session, myself and other legislators had the opportunity and always a pleasure to visit with different school districts. So I have the privilege of representing portions or the entirety of 8 school districts. And so among those communications or forums was the Estimé School District and the Rockford Area School District recently. In both of those legislative forums, the superintendent, members of the school board, et cetera, and the reoccurring theme is the cross-subsidy gap. And while there might be other buckets of revenue, for the most part, they're siloed and prevented to be used. There's only a limited number of buckets that can be used to fund the gap, because there are other revenue sources as part of the formula that can't be tapped into to use because of those barriers or legislative prohibitions. And so I'm just throwing that out there for the edification of this committee, that the reoccurring theme among these conversations was, Senator Lucero, give us the flexibility. While you're giving us money in all these different buckets, we can't necessarily use it in the best choices that we can make locally. And so that was the message they wanted me to bring up here, is to allow them that flexibility, tear down some of these barriers that allow them to fund things like the cross-subsidy gap. And so I throw that out there as we continue the conversations.
Senator McQuaid.
Thank you. And so I, like everybody else, is trying to understand a complex formula here. When we're talking about a cross-subsidy, we're essentially talking about the amount of money that is coming from a general fund to cover unreimbursed services for special education, yes?
Mr. Chair and Senator McQuaid, yes.
Thank you. And so essentially what we're seeing is that so I think I'm in the inner metro. My district has more money coming out of the general fund to cover special education services than, some of the folks in greater Minnesota with 1,000 or less pupils.
Senator and Senator McQuaid, if a district's measured cross-subsidy is greater than these, regional averages, then yes, that district, would have to find those resources from usually other undesignated money in its general fund.
Thank you. And so I guess, I'm looking at this and I'm seeing if there's a group that has, less than 1,000 pupils, the occurrence of complex educational needs would be lower than my district has. We're the third largest district in the state. Does that then square? Does that make sense that our cross-subsidy dollar amount would be higher?
Mr. Chair and Senator McQuaid, members, to Senator Westland's earlier point, I think it's fair to say that the special education financing formulas are unbelievably complex, and I wouldn't even try to explain why an individual district might generate more or less special education aid. But I think in general, changes to the whole special ed formula over the last, say, 15 years, maybe not quite 15 years, but there were substantial reforms to the special ed formula in the middle teens, I think, and the effect of those changes are to, over time, to drive the state aid reimbursement for each district closer to, roughly, 50-55% of its cost. And it's important to think of special ed as in part a cost-based state aid formula, which we don't have a lot in our system. We generally don't calculate state aids based on cost. And there are reasons why one might want to do that, and reasons why the legislature might not want to do that. But special ed is one of them. As I said, over time, a district's state aid should kind of settle into roughly 50-55% of its cost. But some districts aren't there yet, and it's kind of a slow-moving trend over time. A district certainly that has higher costs in general, or enrolls students with more complex needs that generate higher costs, is going to have higher total costs, and that district almost certainly is going to have a higher measured cross-subsidy as well.
Thank you. So just, if I can summarize, the chart that I'm looking at here isn't like dollar per pupil to a district. What I'm looking at here is how much a district is spending in their cross-subsidy based on the pupils and their needs and the lack of reimbursement from the state, or the gap between the reimbursement from the state and the services that are being provided.
Mr. Chair and Senator McQuaid, yes.
Thank you.
So I appreciate all the questions, and members, this is kind of exactly what I was hoping for, that we would get a lot of questions, and not just questions, but comments coming out of this. And I think, again, hopefully Chair Kunish will work with me on this. I think this brings up seeing so many questions around the cross-subsidy. I think, one, we should be looking at what are the requirements that have come from the federal government that have been put on our schools, the services that they have to provide. Two, what has the state put on top of that, that we're telling our schools they must provide. And I think yesterday we also saw some numbers where we're seeing the percentage of students who are increasing over time that are qualifying. And so then that might be something for us as well to be looking at. I believe Senator Farnsworth brought this up yesterday, and asking that question, what is driving this increase? And are there things that we could then be looking at on the front end? That's one of my county commissioners has been talking to me about this for years in the county HHS realm. If we can provide services early, you prevent costs down the line. And I think that's something this discussion, I hope, is driving our desire to dig into this one especially. Because I think many of us have seen this is one of the areas of just astronomical increase in our school budget. How do we get our hands around that and help, not just help them pay for it, but to cap those costs and keep it from being a growing area? So, any follow-up, Senator Kunish?
Thank you. And I totally agree with that, and I'm more than happy to work with you on that, because I think we all collectively recognize that this is what is one of the factors that has some of the biggest struggles for our school districts when they're looking at how to use their general funds in the best way possible. I do want to remind everyone that we did pass legislation with the commitment to cover 50% of that cross-subsidy by 2027, with the hope that it will free up those dollars in the general fund to have the flexibility to use within their district. But if there are ways that we can look at, as you said, looking at being proactive rather than reactive, I think that would benefit all of us and all of our students and all of our school districts. So I too am very much interested and committed to doing that.
Mr. Arneson, hopefully we're not getting you too off base. We have a couple more, questions. Senator Westland.
Just very quickly, and I know I'm stating the obvious here, but I hear Senator Hoffman in my ear. And I just want to make sure that as we're talking about special education services for our students and cost containment and really digging into this, that I hope we also do remember the requirement that we provide a free, appropriate public education to students, and that they get the appropriate special education services that they need to be successful in schools. And, so that's the tension, and I don't think anyone is talking about not providing those services, but I just felt, like I say, I can hear Senator Hoffman, who is such a great advocate for our students with disabilities, that I want to make sure that we are looking at this thoughtfully and trying to understand where the costs are coming from. And some of that is there may be students who are being identified as needing services who maybe in the past would not have been. And Senator Farnsworth brought up the point yesterday that maybe there are different interventions that are appropriate and maybe less costly. But that's the tension here. And again, I just want to make sure that we are remembering that our students who need services really should get them.
Senator McQuaid.
Thank you. And just to Senator Westland's point, what I'm hearing in my head is the parents who have kids with disabilities who are hearing that their kids cost a lot of money to educate. And I really don't want that to be the message that we leave this committee with. And I don't think that's anybody's intention. But kids with disabilities deserve a free, quality public education too. And one of the things that, this is what's hard about doing committee work, is that you focus on your area of jurisdiction, but I'm on human services. And one of the things that you could talk about, on all of these timelines from '03 to today, is that we stopped institutionalizing people in like the 90s, right? And we stopped giving up on kids because they weren't verbal or because they stimmed or because they needed, auditory processing issues, all of those things, right? And we stopped doing that. And so we will see costs increase, we started mainstreaming more kids and giving them more supports to be in the least restrictive setting possible. And so if those are tenets and values that we have, we can't just say like, oh my gosh, all of a sudden special education costs more and we don't know why. Like, it's because we're living into our values. And I think we do need to look at what are early interventions looking like, what is support at home looking like, what are, all of those things I think is really important. How are we giving districts and students and families the most support that they can have? But I don't just want us to talk about any kid as a cost measure, and that their education is somehow like a cost containment problem. And so I just really want to say that kids with disabilities, kids who are neurodivergent, kids who are neurotypical are worthy, valid human beings who deserve a good quality public education in this state, and that is the value of this committee, and that's why we're going to move forward to make sure every kid has that.
Senator Kroon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I don't think anybody on this committee is even suggesting that children that need special education services shouldn't get it. I don't know how this conversation kind of went in that direction, but I've not heard anybody comments have that intention. In fact, I would say getting to the bottom of what's going on here from a financial standpoint and making sure that we have sustainable funding sources will preserve our ability to offer these services to the students who need it. And it could be a matter of, putting children in different settings, more mainstream settings. That is adding to the value. I don't dispute that, but you circle back to your slide on how it varies across regions, and there's obviously something else going on. And so I think it is our duty to kind of look at this and get to the bottom of it without anybody thinking that we have some ulterior motives, like we just want to cap funding or don't want to fund things, because ultimately this work needs to be done to make sure that all of these students are able to get these services in the long term. So that's my goal in looking at this, understanding it, and looking at it in a deep way to make sure that we can do this long into the future.
Senator Farnsworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I guess I kicked off this discussion with my misunderstanding. I looked at this and I was thinking that Greater Minnesota schools were getting less because I misread this, and I'm like, wait a darn minute. But to Senator Kroon's point, I mean, even just as I'm sitting here thinking about this, for whatever reason, it costs more in the metro school districts to provide these services. And I can think of one example, and hopefully MDE or school districts can help us to answer this. But if you take a student that's an EBD student, that's a level 5 student, there are facilities down here that, maybe Eden Prairie High School can say, okay, we can't meet this kid's need here in the high school, but we can send him to a level 5 facility. And those are extremely expensive. And whereas these small schools in Greater Minnesota, like McGregor School District, it's a tiny school district in my Senate district, they don't have that option available, so they just have to make do with what they have. And so they're not paying $40,000 a year for this kid to send him to a level 5 facility. They maybe have an aide or a part-time aide. And so I think that would partially explain that, but I think we do need to get to the bottom of why, and that's probably a big part of it is those like level 5 facilities. But we do have to figure out, okay, why does it seem to cost more to provide what I would guess are similar services in one region versus another? Because statistically, you're not going to have, you're going to have more high needs kids overall in the metro area just because there's, 3.5 million people in the metro and everybody else is in Greater Minnesota. But statistically, throughout the population, there's, we have a couple of, in the Hibbing School District, a couple of students that are blind, I think 14 or 15 that are deaf, hard of hearing. So there's a lot of high need kids as a percentage of the population. So I think this is a good conversation to have, and also, can we learn from one another? Can we learn, how is this school providing services that are just as high quality at a lower price than, or a lower cost? I hate to say price because it sounds like we're talking about grocery shopping. But I think this is an interesting conversation to have. So, and I just sort of thought of just one reason why it might cost more in the metro, because they have those those top-notch facilities that help alleviate the burden on the public school. So, so Mr. Chair, thank you for allowing us to have this discussion.
All right, again, Mr. Anderson, I hope we haven't thrown you off too much. We'll get back to your presentation.
Sure. Mr. Chair, I just have one more slide, and I'll kind of go through it real quick, but, you know, again, in the frame of thinking about ways in which district revenues might vary across districts, you know, we can also think of other categorical programs in addition to the general education revenues that we've discussed and the special ed revenues that we've just been discussing. You know, there are other categorical programs that in some cases provide relatively even distribution of revenues among school districts, and in other cases provide one that, you know, varies somewhat more based on, you know, a district electing into the program, or the program revenues being computed on characteristics of the district that, you know, might vary somewhat across districts. So I indicated a few here, and and I put the two first bullets kind of at the top of the list because, you know, I suspect the committee is going to be, you know, having some additional discussion about these as they're contemplated for changes in the governor's proposal. But these programs include other targeted aids and grants, dual enrollment, PSEO programs, school facilities financing programs, which is, you know, kind of a big deal. It's a lot of resources, and the committee has dug into that at various points in the past. Nutrition programs, community ed programs, and others. So I hope this presentation has been helpful and responsive to your desire, Mr. Chair, for a description of some of these sources of variation in revenue amounts across districts. I know that we've taken questions along the way. I do want, before heading back to my regular seat, to talk briefly about one more document in the packets. It's a stapled landscape style document full of tiny little numbers, and apologies to your optometrists for this, but the title in the top left corner is Fiscal Year 2025 Projected Revenues. These columns display the component programs within general education for, again, these kind of groups of districts in the summary rows at the top, and then for each individual district. And I'll just very quickly orient members to this document because it looks very similar in form to other documents that the committee is going to receive and use over the course of this session. The value in column D is the pupil count, or adjusted average daily membership. This is, you know, we have a few pupil counts in K-12. I would say that adjusted pupil units is probably the most common count that we use to calculate school district revenues. When we're comparing school district revenues, either, you know, among districts or especially across time, then we tend to use a count called average daily membership, which is more kind of a straight unweighted head count of enrollment. So the value in column D is ADMs. And then between columns F and U, those are the revenue amounts per ADM for the components of general ed revenue. And most of these programs are going to be coded in section 126C10, referendum and English learner formulas are coded also in chapter 126C, but not in that particular section.
Mr. Anderson, quick question. So another way of putting that, is that what we would consider the compensatory parts of the formula, these categories?
Mr. Chair, in particular, compensatory revenue would be in column L. And just to use that as an example, following on your question, on average, the state total compensatory, and this, I should say, this document, in contrast to the previous presentation, this document is for all districts and charter schools. So, so the summary data in the state total line would include charter school averages as well. But the compensatory revenue per ADM on average in fiscal year 2025 is $1,027 per ADM. And then if one looks at the next, say, 12 rows of data, you can see how that average amount, might vary across different groups of districts. And then beginning about midway down the page, then we start getting into individual district amounts per pupil. And so, that's an example of a program that is calculated on certain district characteristics. And to the extent that those characteristics, enrolling enrolling kids eligible for free and reduced price lunch, or the kind of size and concentration of school district facilities in those districts, that can have an effect on a district's compensatory aid. The totals in columns V, W, and X are the total general education revenue. So column V is the sum of the previous columns. Column W and X, again, back to the first slide in our previous deck, the aid and levy amounts, those sum to the revenue amount. But it kind of gives you a sense of the proportion for each individual district, how much of general ed revenue is being raised from the property taxpayer and how much is being paid in state aid. And then the last two columns on the page, columns Y and Z, are informational for you all and display for each district the referendum market value per resident pupil unit and the ANTC per pupil. That would be the measure against which each district's equalizing aid would be calculated in the equalizing formulas. So I'm glad to take questions about this, but I wanted to prepare it and make it available as kind of somewhat more detailed information if folks are interested in individual districts.
Quick follow-up. So then, maybe I'm getting my terms wrong when I'm thinking compensatory, but is L the only one that's tied to the formula, or are other categories in here driven by what we put on the formula every year? I guess that's what I always have in my head when I think compensatory, but I'm wondering which of these categories is tied directly to the formula as compared to ones that are based, like transportation sparsity, I know is not tied necessarily to the formula, it's tied to, so I,
Yeah.
yeah.
Mr. Chair, good question. There are a few in general ed that are tied to the formula allowance. So, for example, declining enrollment is calculated as in part a function of the formula allowance. Compensatory, the same way. Some of the sparsity aids are a function of the formula allowance. The referendum caps are a function of the formula allowance. Those caps don't impact every district, but at least in theory, they're in the code, they're a function of the formula allowance. Some of the alternative attendance adjustments, this is kind of a collection of little adjustments on the back end. If a charter school uses the school district to provide transportation, the school district basically retains a portion of the aid that would otherwise be paid to the charter school, and keeps that aid, to cover the cost of providing transportation for those charter school kids. So, some of those would be a function of the formula allowance. So there are some in here, and as you know, some categorical programs that are also a function of the formula allowance.
Senator Lucero.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just a quick question to clarify. So looking at columns V, W, and X, am I correct in my understanding that column W is the amount of funding per pupil that is coming from the state, whereas column X is the amount of funding per pupil that's generated locally? And then the sum of those two columns is the funding per pupil, which is column V.
Mr. Chair and Senator Lucero, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay, so myself and Senator Gustafson have been chatting here, and we're comparing our two school districts as this presentation's been going on, two of our school districts. And so I would just, as we look down column W, members, you see a lot, the funding from the state, there's a lot of numbers that start with 10,000, I see 11,000, there's 14,000, 13,000, 12,000. But if you flip to page 7 of this spreadsheet, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The top 6 school districts on that page are all districts that I represent. And notice how they all start with a 10, and going down to STMA, it starts with a 9. And I'm just highlighting that as how significantly less school districts are receiving, such as STMA, compared to other districts, and why this is such a high priority issue. One of the additional feedback that I received from both of these recent legislative forums in 2 of these 8 school districts were Senator Lucero, contrary to the headlines that we saw in the last 2 years, historic funding, unprecedented education funding, or along those lines, it is not making it down to many school districts, and the hardship continues. And that was the message they wanted me to carry forward to this committee and to the legislature. The system, the formula is broken. It is a Frankenstein of a formula with all these categoricals, and it is long past time to do a fundamental reform. And I appreciate this conversation and highlighting how broken this funding formula is. It's antiquated, it's Frankenstein. We can no longer tinker on the edges, because when you look at Albertville St. Michael, for example, it is the opposite of achieving academic opportunity. There are opportunities that are not being allowed for students in my area as a direct result of this broken formula. So again, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Swedzinski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Arneson, for your presentation today. I have 2 questions, and I'm just wondering, and maybe you address this, and my 2 questions deal with column F or E, column F and column J. Column F, if that's the basic formula that should be in my head, it should be the same for every school district in the state. And I realize all the numbers hover around 8,000. Why are some 7,984 and others 8,120? Is that somewhere else in this chart, or?
Mr. Chair and Senator Swedzinski, it's a very good question, and I think Ms. Hofer and I were laughing about this and figured that a question like this was coming, because it's a little confusing, because basic revenue is calculated as a function of the statutory allowance times adjusted pupil units, right? So that's the pupil base that we use. When you divide that total product by average daily membership, you don't get back to the statutory allowance. You get to some number that's different. And so think of ADM as like a head count. Think of adjusted pupil units as a weighted head count, meaning we assign more weight in the count to secondary students. So the basic revenue figures here, yeah, are in the same neighborhood, but not exactly identical. And that's because we're dividing the revenue by ADM, not by APU, or adjusted pupil units.
So districts that have more kids in 712, or in proportion to districts that don't have those high numbers, would be a little higher in that column.
Mr. Chair and Senator Swedzinski, that's exactly right. And
Okay.
Think of a good example like an elementary only charter school. If you looked down the list and saw in the charter school data, well, why is this district basic revenue per ADM particularly low? It's because they don't enroll any secondary students who are weighted higher in the calculation.
Senator Swedzinski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And then if you could, and maybe you explain this, but I don't understand column J, declining enrollment. And thank you, Mr. Arneson, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Arneson.
Mr. Chair and members, column J is declining enrollment. So a district in which the adjusted pupil units in a fiscal year is less than the adjusted pupil units in the previous year is going to generate some amount of declining enrollment revenue. And that revenue amount is, it's a fraction of the formula allowance times the number of, times the difference in the counts. So just to think of an example, so a district that enrolls 900 students this year, but they had 1,000 students last year, the declining enrollment for that district is going to be 1,000 minus 900, 100 students times the formula allowance for that year times, I think it's 28% of that figure. So that's the amount of declining enrollment revenue that that district's going to generate for that year.
Yeah, so I believe these are great questions, and this is why I wanted to get into this as well. Like I said, I think we would say a high school offering a chemistry class is going to drive more expense than what an elementary school class is going to have, why a high school class would see that increased weight to your declining enrollment. I think if you suddenly see a drop in students, the school is still going to maybe drop class sizes, but maybe not reduced in staff, and so we're helping them keep that. But I think as we talked about, I think part of the discussion that I want to have as well, back when the funding formulas, which are incredibly complicated to understand, were first put in place, and when we looked at creating what the amount was that was on the formula and the calculations to get to all these different categoricals, it was a balance. It was a pretty close. But what year was the funding formula put in place? Wasn't that the middle 80s, Mr. Arneson? That was the Minnesota Miracle, correct?
That would have been, is it 71?
71,
Yeah.
okay, longer ago.
So kind of to your point, Mr. Chair, 71, the result of the 71 reforms were I think the first time in state history where the amount from the state exceeded the amount from local property taxpayers. So that was kind of a tipping point where the state, the legislature made the decision that, most of the funding for our school system is going to come from the state. And after that point, less from local property taxpayers.
So, yeah, thank you, Mr. Arneson. And I think, so what we can see from that is every time we increase the base formula, those calculations drive some of those disparities in the categoricals to a larger difference. And I think, so when we look at, I appreciate what we see in the 2003 from your charts where the state kind of changed the way they do, and we saw this shift. I think that's something too that we have to be looking at as a committee. How do we bring the disparities back together based on the formula? How do we bring that so we see some of these numbers being closer together? So, sorry again for,
Just one more comment.
Senator Kunish.
It's really fascinating to look at this spreadsheet and look at the population of communities that we're all familiar with, that we all represent, looking at all of the different items that bring us to column Z, that adjusted net tax capacity per adjusted pupil unit, which is, basically what a school district is receiving per pupil. But I think it's really important to look at the makeup of the community that are receiving those higher amounts of dollars. Operationals, our English learners, transportation costs. And I think what's really important also is to look at the column Q, the referendum, and look at the, the spread of dollars that communities are willing to put towards their school district. There are some, of course, our charter schools don't receive these because they can't levy, but when you look at these different communities that are putting their dollars into their school district, that really drives up that final number, and that can be quite significant. And so it's important to look at the full picture and not just one or two numbers, and recognize that while I agree this, we do need to do a lot of work on this, when we look at the disparity between these districts, it's really important to look at the full picture and not just a few of the columns that you want to pick and choose.
Thank you. And I think one of the things that when we look at those numbers as well, to Senator Lucero's point, I think when you see some of these really small school districts that do not have a lot of commercial industrial, it's harder for them to cast that vote because they know the burden falls on their own property taxes. When you have that high commercial industrial, whether it's, again, right or not, it's easier, I think, in those districts to cast that yes vote, knowing, well, those businesses are going to be paying the burden of what it's going to cost. So I think that's, and again, that's where we get into these equalization discussions, trying to help the communities that don't have that commercial industrial base to be able to have that same ability. So I'll get to you, Senator Gustafson, but Senator Westland.
Senator Kunish kind of made my point for me, is that, as we're looking in those final, the VWX columns, and if you look at column X, I mean, there are communities that aren't, that have far lower numbers on the levy piece. And I think Senator Kunish's point, and again, this comes to what's the property tax base? Is it commercial? Is it residential? Whatever. But there are communities also, just to be really clear, that are not voting on levies and referenda to support their schools. And that does account for some of the disparity. I have always been sort of the opinion that funding our schools on property taxes, again, it doesn't entirely make sense to me. And I hope that one of the things that we might be able to do this year and in years to come is to take a look at, are there other models for financing our public education that are less complicated, that make more sense, and that ensure that each school district gets the resources that they need to teach every child and help them move forward in their lives to be successful. And I don't know if such things exist. I've been told Illinois might be doing some interesting things, but I think it would be valuable for us to have some informational hearings on what are some other proposed models for supporting public education, and making sure we are adequately funding the education so that it is meaningful for all of our students.
Senator Gustafson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just agree with what everyone is saying, but I would like to highlight one of my biggest school districts, which is Centennial. And I think this is where Senator Lucero and I have found quite a bit of common ground in that both St. Michael Albertville and Centennial have similar disparities. And I'll just invite Senator Crewin into the conversation, whether he wants to be or not, because we also, we share Centennial School District. Both of us represent Centennial School District. So I would just say that while I agree with all of that, and while, the needs might be, as far as ELL learners in some of these more, closer to the Twin Cities school districts, I will point out that Centennial is a large school district, and we are a growing community, much like St. Michael Albertville. So we have a lot of those same needs, but we are getting significantly less money. And if you look at what we're paying in property taxes, it's over $2,000. I, as a longtime teacher at Centennial, experience what happens when we don't pass a levy or a referendum, because, you have to make cuts. And then all of a sudden, at the end of the year, 20 teachers are cut. I was one of them. Thankfully, I was hired back on the last day. But, if you're not tenured, you're gone. Those are the real impacts. And then you have overcrowded classrooms and all of that. And we have a lot of those same needs that other schools have that are closer to Minneapolis and St. Paul. But we just don't have the support. And the people that live in our community are just tired of being taxed all the time to support our schools. If we have an equalization in funding, now we are getting a more equitable amount of the general fund. So I think that is where we get frustrated, that it just doesn't seem like the formula has caught up to a lot of these growing communities. And that's really kind of what I think we're trying to advocate for.
Senator Crewin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And since I was involuntarily brought into this discussion, I feel obligated to respond. No, I'm just kidding. I echo what Senator Gustafson said, particularly with respect to Centennial, which is actually doing a really good job, given the challenges, particularly in equalization that they're facing. And I want to make that clear. And to Senator Westland's point, I think we should have a comprehensive look at how we fund education in the state. I think that would be an exciting endeavor, looking at all the formulas. But in the meantime, I think the equalization one does stand out above the rest in that, based on the way that the statutory framework is for most of that, the equalization factors, the way it's designed is over time, effectively, most school districts are just going to fall off. And if the legislature doesn't act on equalization, it has the effect of effectively eliminating it. And so if the legislature thought it was a good idea back when, however many years ago, it's still an issue, and it's one that we have to, I think, periodically revisit while we're looking at a comprehensive review of all the formulas and figuring out the best way to get money into the classroom, which is what at least my constituents expect me to do. And so I think there's a number of ways we can go about it. But to Senator Gustafson's point, I think equalization is the most immediate for a lot of our districts. Thanks.
Senator Umu Verbatim.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to ask one question. This has been such a helpful discussion. Thank you. Is it possible to get the chart that we saw on 22 for the English language learner cross subsidy? I'm just curious to see how that breaks out. And then I wanted to make one comment as well that I know is sort of a unique problem that some of our Minneapolis and St. Paul and probably some of the inner metro districts face, where there's a higher concentration of charter and non-public schools, and they're able to bill those special education costs back to the district. So that can also really impact those higher costs that we're seeing. Just another thing for us to think about, but really interested to see what it looks like for English language learner cross subsidies. Thank you.
Do you have an answer for that, or can you get back? And then if you want to finish up your presentation, being we've cut you off multiple times.
Mr. Chair, members, I'm happy to find that information and deliver it to the committee.
Any more on your presentation, or are you good? All right. Members, I think we've got one last presentation from Ms. Hofer.
Good morning, members. In your packets today, you will find 2 additional spreadsheets. They are both single-page, legal-size landscape spreadsheets. They are similarly titled Education Finance Grant Appropriations. One is specific to educational entities, and one is specific to nonprofits, and both are for grants within the education finance budget jurisdiction for the fiscal years 2024 through 2029. These documents were prepared in response to a request from the chair to better understand how the grant appropriations from this committee flow to nonprofits. And so I'll start briefly by explaining that document, then I'll explain the educational entities document before giving you just a brief overview of how grant procedures and reporting requirements work. So on the spreadsheet that has the grant appropriations to nonprofit organizations, so this covers 3 biennia, and that would be the 2024-25, 2026-27, and 28-29 bienniums. Going down the left-hand side of the page, you will see names of grant appropriations, and these appropriations had been made for the fiscal year 2024-2025 years, and the base amounts in the forecast are shown for fiscal years 2026 and later. The first 3 appropriations, computer science education, innovative service learning grants, and statewide teacher mentoring program, you'll also see on the top of the educational entities page. And that's because these 3 appropriations, the recipients can be either nonprofits or educational entities or some combination of both. With the innovative service learning grants specifically, there's a requirement that there be a partnership typically between an educational entity and a nonprofit or business organization. Within the top 3 grants on each page and then those below, they are organized first by the grants that have ongoing base funding, and then below that you will see any that were one time, and then those are organized alphabetically within each of those categories. And on the educational entities grants, the spreadsheet is organized in a similar fashion. I'll note that for this spreadsheet, educational entities was defined as what you typically would think of as the K-12 or the higher education school systems. So these would be recipients such as school districts, charter schools, cooperative units, intermediate school districts, the regional centers of excellence, or higher education institutions. There's one exception to that, and that would be on line 33, the Aspiring Teachers of Color Scholarships. That's an appropriation that's transferred to the Department of Higher Education, and then from there, the recipients would be undergraduate or graduate students pursuing teaching degrees. And so members, I'll let you take a look through those spreadsheets and discuss them at your leisure. Before we do that, I was also asked to briefly describe how the grant processes work and any reporting requirements associated with them. And I'll preface this by stating that I am by no means an expert on the grant procedures at the Department of Education or the Professional Educator Licensing and Standards Board, but I can give you generally an understanding of how those work. So to begin with, once a grantee is selected, either by being legislatively named in an appropriation or being awarded a grant through a competitive grant process, that grantee would then work with the Department of Education or the Professional Educator Licensing and Standards Board to develop a grant agreement that would include such things as the term of the grant, a work plan, any goals, strategies, or activities related to the grant, and then develop a budget for the grant. And I'll note that grant agreements can be amended by mutual agreement of the 2 parties. Grantees typically receive funding through a reimbursement process, meaning that expenses cannot be incurred until that grant agreement is processed and agreed to, and that the expenses would need to align with the budget that was agreed upon in the grant agreement. Typically, grantees would receive reimbursement for expenses within 30 days of receipt of the payment request. Typically, agencies do have processes for budget revisions as well in case a grantee finds that their budget needs to deviate from what was originally submitted. Under Minnesota statute section 127A20, there is a statute for evidence-based education grants. This statute applies to any grants that were awarded on or after July 1st, 2022. And the purpose of this section is to create a process to describe, measure, and report on the effectiveness of any pre-kindergarten through grade 12 education program that's funded in whole or in part through funds appropriated by the legislature to the Commissioner of Education for grants to organizations. And because this is within the Department of Education statutes, this would not apply to grants awarded through PELSB. What this statute requires is that each grantee's application include a list of goals, and to the extent practicable, these must be aligned to state and federal accountability systems. It must include a list of strategies used to meet the goals and a data collection plan to measure effectiveness of the strategies. The statute also requires grantees to report to the Commissioner of Education and the chairs of the Committees of Education within 180 days of the grant period ending. The report must include the data that was collected, and it must evaluate the effectiveness of the strategies, and it may propose alternative strategies for future use. Additionally, there are some grants that have reporting requirements that go beyond what would be required in statute. And these could be things such as a specific date on which a report must be filed, additional progress reports throughout the grant period, specific data elements that must be included in the report. Sometimes reporting requirements require recommendations be made to the legislature, or they include recommended statutory changes. Additionally, the reporting requirements could require distribution of the report to additional commissioners or committees. Finally, there are a couple of other statutes that relate to the grant process that are outside of the K-12 education statutes. So those could be found in Chapter 16B, Sections 97 through 981. And these typically relate to audit requirements, evaluations, administrative costs, and risk assessments for the grantees. With that, I'm glad to take any questions from members or let you discuss at your leisure.
Yeah, thank you very much. And members, part of my request for this is, as we're trying to get our hands around everything that we are appropriating money to, this was one piece I wanted folks to make sure they're aware of. Are there any questions at this point around this piece? Not seeing any, so I would, we have a save folder in our big packets. These sheets, I think, will be wonderful for referring back to at some point. So if you want to leave them in there or take them back to your office to have them to look at as you want, I think that we'll be re-referring to these multiple times over the course of the year. But with that, Senator Kunesh, do you want to give us a preview for next Tuesday's hearing?
Sure, and thank you all for this really robust and I think helpful conversation. I think we're all leaving with a few more questions that we arrived with, and we arrived with a lot of questions, but hopefully over this next session, we'll be able to dig a little bit more into some of these unique situations, because we all recognize that most of our schools are struggling, especially under the certain circumstances that they find themselves in. Tuesday's hearing will focus on the attendance issue. If you haven't found or seen the Student Attendance Pilot Program School District Strategy and Goal Report, will be Emma, my assistant, will be sending that out to us, but we'll be looking at the attendance issue, hearing from some of the schools that are participating in the pilot project, and just sort of grounding ourselves in the issue around attendance. If there are folks out there that want to testify or add to this conversation, please contact Emma Zellmer as soon as possible, and let her know that. And if there are any handouts that people want to provide, also get those to Emma just as soon as you can. And I hope, again, we have a really good, robust conversation around this issue.
Thank you, Chair Kunesh. And in case you had missed it, members, yes, Thursday, tomorrow, we will not be having a committee hearing. And as of right now, we've kind of agreed Thursdays will be tentative if something important comes up. Otherwise, we're likely not going to have Thursday morning hearings at this point. Next Wednesday, I'm going to be having a hearing, bringing in superintendents and maybe some school board folks to talk about not just some of the things from the last 2 years, but just open it up in general, the things that we as a state require above and beyond federal requirements, that they maybe would say maybe outlive their usefulness, or difficult for them to put in place, put some really big constraints on their budgets. We just want to hear from them as far as what they're seeing. I think many of us, when we travel to our districts, hear those stories. I think it's important to let them come forward and share some of that with us to help spur, again, hopefully some discussion like what we had today. So again, if, folks want to, they can reach out to either Ed Cook or to Emma to get on the list and provide us the information they want for that hearing as well. Members, any final questions? Seeing none, we will adjourn.